Not every team contends, at least not every year. Losing sucks, let's face it. But sometimes losing is the smartest path to winning. Today we are embracing that strategic suck on the Dynasty Compass. Welcome to Dynasty Compass. I am your host, Jeff Blaylock, the other Jeff B. from Football Guys. Today we are firmly in the South, the land of rebuilders. Now, in our compass metaphor, our ultimate goal is true north, which is perennial contention. And south is obviously in the opposite direction. It's a 180-degree turn from north. And when things go poorly, we've all heard the expression that things are going south. But south is not about losing. There is losing involved, yes, but south is about losing in order to build a winner. It's about rebuilding. It's about taking a low-performing roster and transforming it through intention, through patience, through strategy, and, yes, losing to turn it into a high-performing roster. Now, rebuilding, in our metaphor of the South, gets misunderstood by a lot of people. People think it's giving up or it's quitting. It's throwing in the towel for the season. It's really not that. South is just a direction where losing is actually a tool. Losing becomes fuel for future winning. So it isn't resignation. It's more recalibration. The season in the South is painful in the moment, but it can be beautiful in hindsight. However, losing without a strategy is just losing. Losing with a strategy is rebuilding. So just because a team is losing doesn't mean it's rebuilding. Losing managers can panic, and they can start making desperate moves to try to turn their fortunes around very quickly. That rarely works. It leads right into the number one mistake that dynasty managers make, which is making moves without a strategy. And desperation is most definitely not a strategy. Acting out of desperation is managing emotionally. We want to manage strategically. And with a losing roster, managing strategically means embracing what I like to call the strategic suck. And the strategic suck is the intentional willingness to lose now to take the steps that you need to take to help you win later. Later as in future seasons, not later as in later this season. Now, this is a unique thing to dynasty formats because we care about the future time frame as well as the present one. In redraft, when we fall out of playoff contention, it's just over for us. It's simply over. We will get them next year. But in Dynasty, we don't get that reset in August that we get in redraft. The calendar is not going to bail us out of a bad roster. We have to manage our way out of losing, and sometimes that means accepting more losing to get there. And there are several key elements of a strategic suck. The first and most important is a deliberate decision to prioritize future success over trying to save face now. Losing sucks. I get it. We don't like the trash talk that we're going to get from our league mates when we lose to them week after week after week. But losing is a critical component to this strategy. So saving face by winning a few games will get us a more respectable record now, but it's ultimately counterproductive. We try to avoid actions that are counterproductive to our strategy. Winning is really the only thing that is counterproductive to rebuilding, at least in year one. There are ways of optimizing your lineup downward without tanking illegally, and that's another key element of the strategic suck. We are intentionally scoring fewer points than we could be scoring. Do this in several ways. We can trade away productive players for non-producing assets. We can start low-ceiling players instead of higher-ceiling players. We can make defensible decisions that results in us starting our less than best possible lineup, and that's okay. Another element of the strategic suck is assembling assets that will appreciate, things like younger players, draft picks, broken toys. These are the kinds of things that give us flexibility in the future as well as production. We're also trying to extract maximum value from our veterans before they fully depreciate. We're exchanging them for draft picks, for broken toys, for developing talents. We're trying to avoid having to cut healthy players as we rebuild. If we need a roster spot, we need to cut somebody, it's a lot better if we can try to trade them to get something in return instead of just simply cutting them off of our roster. And finally, the last aspect of the strategic suck that's critically important is protecting our own draft capital without violating league rules. Trading away draft picks is not really the strategy that we're trying to do. And what are we trying to do? The point of the strategic suck is not just to lose. We could do that without a strategy. That's pretty easy. The point of a strategic suck is to maximize our own draft capital, which means getting as early a pick as possible. And when I mean our own draft capital, I don't mean all of the picks we have. I mean our specific pick, the one that's assigned to us, my own first round pick. These are the foundations of rebuilding. So before we talk about how to suck strategically, we've got to deal with the elephant in the room. It's the word that nobody wants to say, but everyone is thinking about. It's the dreaded T word, tanking. If you look up the definition of tanking, it looks an awful lot like what I've just been calling the strategic suck. It boils down to losing games intentionally to improve draft position. But there's some differences in the mechanics that are critical. Here are the hallmarks of tanking, and these are the specific things that we are trying not to do when we're in a strategic suck. The first of those is starting an automatic zero. These are players on IR. They're players on bye. They're players who are going to be ruled out. Starting one of those players is an obvious sign of tanking. So is leaving players who are returning from injury on our bench. If I had George Kittle earlier this season, he was out for a few games. If I continued to leave him on my bench, even though he was back and healthy, that's a hallmark of tanking. Another is claiming players who have no fantasy relevant roles whatsoever off of waivers and then inserting them into our starting lineup. And finally, and a very obvious one, is just leaving blanks in our lineup, simply putting no one into a starting spot. That's either a sign we've given up for the season and aren't paying attention, or we are tanking, and none of that is contemplated in a strategic suck. The bottom line is that any strategic suck strategy needs to be implemented within the rules of your league. Competitive integrity of a league is important. Being blatant about it hurts your reputation as a manager. And in my experience, it increases the chances that other managers are going to leave the league. We really want those managers to stay around. We want this to be a community experience with a group of people that we like to play fantasy football with. We don't want to be driving them away by either violating the integrity of the league outright or by bending it so hard that it makes people question whether they want to stay here. So don't tank and call it a strategy. It's tanking. So how do we suck without tanking? Well, let's get practical. There are ways of executing the strategy without crossing the line. The most important of these is to set a valid, defensible starting lineup each week. No guys who are out are in our lineup. Everyone is active. We didn't leave our healthy players on the bench, our best ones. Unlike real sports, we don't have the excuse of giving someone a veteran rest day or holding out a player who's not 100% healthy. We need to have them in our lineups. But that doesn't mean that we have to set the absolutely best possible lineup. There are defensible ways of choosing players who are less likely to hit this week, but who aren't our fifth string tight end. The first and most important of these is to favor floor over ceiling. We want to favor a floor, a guaranteed lower level of points, than risk somebody going off for 2 touchdowns on us. So we want flex players with lower yards per reception or fewer fantasy points per touch. If I had to choose between Ricky Pearsall and Brandon Cooks, Pearsall is injured at the moment, so it's a very easy choice, but let's say that he's not. Pearsall has 20 catches, 327 yards, 16.4 yards per catch, 2.6 PPR points per touch. Brandon Cooks has 19 catches, 1 fewer, but he has half as many yards, 165. He's only averaging 8.7 yards per catch and is under 2 PPR points for touch. He has a lower average depth of target. He has fewer yards after the catch. Brandon Cooks is the one I want to start over Ricky Pearsall, and it is defensible. He is one of the leading receivers for his team. I also want to avoid touchdown-dependent players despite their lower floor. So think someone like Nick Westbrook-Akine in 2024. He only caught 32 passes, but 9 of them were touchdowns. He had an exceedingly low floor, which we like. We like low floors when we're trying to suck. But he could score a touchdown at any moment, and in PPR formats, a touchdown is at least 7 points, plus the yardage. You don't want that. We prefer a much lower, safer floor. A second way of getting there is to choose a stingier defensive matchup. If we're talking about 2 primarily slot receivers, one is playing San Francisco this year and the other is playing the LA Chargers. Well, the LA Chargers give up half the PPR points to slot receivers than San Francisco on average. So if I could defensively start the guy playing against the Chargers, I want to do that. I can also play running backs who are in more ambiguous kinds of committee situations. Start someone in a backfield where no one is typically getting 50% of the touches, and especially if we're talking about the guy who gets typically the second most of those. That is a way of starting someone that is defensible who may not be the lead role on their team in that situation. In PPR formats, we're also looking for running backs who don't play on third down. Why? Well, because third down is when you throw. So third down backs catch balls. We don't want that. We don't want those points coming to us. So we'd rather start running backs who are only on first and second down. You want to start the wide receiver 3s on a good offense. You want to start the wide receiver 2s on a bad offense. We want to watch the weather and start players who are in bad weather, except maybe running backs. We don't want to do that. And especially when a dome team is on the road in a cold situation or is in a bad weather situation outdoors, it's a great place to start their lower end receivers because they're probably going to have a really terrible day. We also play guys on teams with a backup quarterback, especially if it's that quarterback's first start or if it's on the road. All of these techniques here are ways of lowering our points at the margins without blatantly tanking. What we're trying to do is pick the lower floor, lower point scoring options, but still defensible. They're still starter players in their situations. They still have fantasy relevant roles, just may not be as relevant as someone else's role in any particular given week. By doing this, we can take between 5 and 20 points out of our starting lineup, depending on how many players we're having to start in our overall situation. Those can be easily the difference between winning and losing. In this case, we really want the losing part, so we like to take those points out of our lineup. There are also some roster management hacks that we can do that will take away some of our points down the road. We can, for example, trade for a player who hasn't had their bye week yet. So when they have their bye week, we can't put them in our lineup. We can't get their points. They need to fit your overall strategy if you're going to do this, but it's an effective way of essentially benching a starter in a week because they don't have a game. You're supposed to bench them. You can also trade for broken toys. In the last episode, we talked about the island of broken toys and what an important developmental tool that is for rebuilding teams, which we're in the South, to go out and acquire a player who's not performing right now. We can't start an injured player. They can't score points for us. If we send away a productive player for a broken toy, it's a defensible trade because it helps us in the future. It also helps us in the present because we just took between 8 and 15 points out of our lineup every week. You can also stretch the IR rules a little bit if your league allows you to keep a player on IR and let you set a lineup, even if they aren't eligible. I wouldn't push on this really hard. I certainly wouldn't do it for weeks at a time, but it is an ability that just lets you keep that starter in that IR slot an extra week, keeps them out of your lineup. And obviously, you want to avoid waiver wire targets that are actually going to help you win this week. You want future value, not immediate value. So when you go out on the waiver wire as a rebuilder to bring someone in, you don't want that person to be a star in your lineup now. They can be one later, but you don't want them now. And in some leagues, you're actually discouraged from making waiver claims at all once you are eliminated from playoff contention. And that's fine, because that means you're not going to be importing any talent that's going to help you now. The point of all of these strategic suck strategies is to reduce your chances of winning at the margins, not by leaving gaping holes in your lineup that will get you accused of tanking. We want to let variance work for us for a change instead of against us. It's like in the movie Star Wars. When I was a kid, it was just Star Wars. For many of you, it will be now Star Wars Chapter 4, A New Hope. In any event, in the movie Star Wars, there is that scene where Han Solo tells Chewie to fly casually. That's what we're trying to do with a strategic suck. We're trying to lose casually without drawing a bunch of attention to ourselves. But honestly, even a little bit of attention is okay, because the reality is that dynasty leagues need Southbound teams. Healthy leagues need rebuilding teams. Rebuilding teams play important roles without which a league is going to get stagnant. Now, we've all been in redraft leagues where no one trades with anyone. It's not just a lack of imagination or guts. It's just the system's not set up to encourage that. No one is motivated to trade. Why? Everyone has the same goal, to win right now. So no one is really motivated to help everyone. Every team in a redraft league is, in our way of thinking about it using the compass, they're all in the East. They're all in wait and see mode. Sure, there can be mutually beneficial trades that make each team better in the current season, but these are really rare. In my longest running home league, there hasn't been a trade in 3 years. And that was between me and another guy at the top of the standings. I sent him one of my 4 startable wide receivers for one of his 3 startable running backs, and we were both better because of it. But that kind of alignment in redraft is very rare, because the valuations of the players are based entirely on current production and a little bit by emotional attachment. But there's very little variability in the way that we can value a player in redraft, because the time frame is right now. So waivers become the only source of talent acquisition in redraft leagues, and they are notoriously poor suppliers of difference-making leagues. Dynasty is a whole other animal. Now, rebuilding teams, as part of their efforts to rebuild, become critical sources of talent acquisition for contending teams, and they're a critical home for offloading non-performing talent. In our Trade Wins episodes, we talked about how players can have different values depending on the situations that different managers find themselves in. The difference in valuation based on those situations, based on which time frame that they are looking at, is what makes trading easier. It's easier to find ways to make both teams better, one in the present, one in the future. In redraft, we're both trying to make things better in the present. In Dynasty, we have this whole other time frame to work with. In our most recent episode, we talked about broken toys. These are injured players who are not producing right now. In redraft, we just drop them because they're worthless in the lone time horizon we have the rest of the season. But in Dynasty, they are assets with value in that second time horizon, future seasons. And what's more, they are discounted in the current present time frame, but they're not worthless like they are in redraft. They have value. They can return value. And where does that value come from for a broken toy? It comes predominantly from Southbound rebuilding teams. So far from tanking, the movement of producing players from non-contending teams to contending teams is actually a necessary feature of a healthy dynasty league. And they get the non-performing assets in return. That cycle of talent allows the league's dynamics to shift from year to year. Otherwise, changes would come very slowly with waivers and with whatever draft picks each team is awarded each year, those being the only vehicles of improvement. So the strategic suck opens up a lot of avenues to move talent around the league to accomplish goals in two different time frames that make both partners in the trade better. And as we've said before, that's the only answer to the question who won this trade is both. We want both teams to be better. The strategic suck is what opens up a lot of those avenues to trades that make both teams better. Now, the only thing that can truly derail a strategic suck strategy is winning. So we don't want to suck at sucking. And I have a rebuilding team that's doing exactly that. It has somehow won 4 of its last 5 games because I have hit opponents who have had absolutely rock bottom performances from some of their players. I was in last place just 4 weeks ago. You have the number 1 overall pick. I'm now in 8th place with the number 5 overall pick and find myself 1 game out of a playoff spot. It will get worse if I give into any kind of temptation to make a run at the playoffs. That would be a strategic mistake. Don't suddenly turn east because your team is in a playoff race. A rebuilding team is in a playoff race. Your team is not good enough to do that. And you definitely don't want to turn west by acquiring win now assets that completely undoes everything you've done up to this point to build a successful suck, to have a successful rebuilding strategy. You need to stay on that southerly course. So pride, the dreams of making an improbable title run, getting caught in the emotion of an unexpected playoff chase, all of these things can break a strategic suck. So dithering on this strategy is the equivalent of sucking at sucking. You don't want to suck at sucking. You just simply want to suck. You must commit and see it through. Yeah, losing sucks. I get it. And if you're losing, you have a few choices. You can do nothing and keep losing. You can act out of desperation to try to win and keep losing. Or you can embrace the strategic suck and lose for now, but start winning later. All 3 of those choices, doing nothing, being desperate, and embracing the strategic suck, all 3 of those choices share one thing in common, losing. But only one of them leads to winning, and that is the strategic suck. You may be throwing in the towel for this season. That's to get stronger for future seasons. This is not a surrender. This is not a failure. You're not a failed manager if you have to rebuild. You're just simply a rebuilder. Losing does not mean being lost. You know exactly where you're going. It's a recalibration. It's a rebuild. Sometimes the road to true north has to go through the south. Walk it with purpose. Next week, we're going to explore the region between the 4 directions. Call it Dynasty Purgatory, and how to plot a course to, well, anywhere when we are in that situation. There's not necessarily one strategy that gets you where you want to go, so we'll explore several. So I want to thank you so much for listening or watching today. Please like, please subscribe, please review, please recommend to friends, please share on social media. I love all of that. That gives us an opportunity to get in front of a little bit bigger audience every week to share our knowledge and to share the pathways that we're trying to create toward perennial contention, true north in our compass metaphor. So go win your week, unless you shouldn't or you don't want to, and go win your league eventually. Thanks for watching or listening. We'll see you next week.